we have enough guests. And of course, I should start with it actually, but I wanted to thank SPLOT Institute for the invitation for this discussion. That's the first thing. And second, let me thank all of you that participate in the SPLOT Institute spend, and thank you for being here today to talk about globalization for a moment. Okay, so I think that we have only these votes as for now. Okay, there are a few coming. So as we see, we have more votes for ugly globalization than bad, and more than good. Okay, we have the draw between good and bad, but ugly is winning. Let's switch to the next question. You can, if you are joining us with the survey, you can answer the first question, of course. But when it comes to the second, please think about where we are in the globalization. Has it reached its peak and will decrease in coming decades or in this decade, or we are surviving, or globalization has gone through turbulent times and will rebound in few years or maybe decades? So share your thoughts. We see the dots coming and answering this question. And I think that this certainly shows that you know what we are talking about today, and you see what's happening. That there are many voices about the start of deglobalization, about globalization reaching its limits. As for now, 75%, but we shouldn't maybe speak about percent when we have so not enough people voting, but certainly more of you want to say that globalization is ugly and has reached its peak. So let me stop here about this. Maybe in the end of the presentation we can come to it and vote again. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. But what about globalization? So if we are speaking about globalization, of course, I will not make myself talk about every step in the history of globalization, but there's one theory about globalization from Richard Baldwin from the book The Great Convergence, when he's speaking how the globalization is unfolding and what were the main the big steps in development of what we now understand as a globalization. So when we think about moving goods from manufacturing production side to the consumers, and so consumption of goods, but also services, in the history for long time it was very costly to move everything, move goods, move ideas, move people, and we have seen that there wasn't the production and consumption was bundled. And in the 19th century, with the Industrial Revolution, happened this first big unbundling when costs of moving goods became decreased, and actually moving goods became cheaper, and we could think about manufacturing where it's cheaper, where it's more convenient, and to using advantages of different sites where we can produce certain goods. So this was the first big unbundling that unfolded through years, and actually was evolving and developing very fast in the 20th century, and with the all other developments like container ships, we could trade more. So this cost of moving goods was decreasing even more in the 20th century, and especially in its second half. But what we see in the 1919 years and further on was also second unbundling with the ICT revolution, when the cost of moving ideas helped actually not only offshore manufacturing, but also offshore some processes that are connected with manufacturing. And it means that also management of the production could be as moved away from developed markets and from the consumers. We could think about moving also other parts of services connected to the manufacturing processes. For example, also high-tech technologies development. But what still is a problem, and we see that it might be in the future less costly, is the cost of moving people. It's still very costly, and it costs, for example, time. And the telerobotics here might be the revolution that will help reduce this cost, and somebody will be able to offer services, for example, medical treatment from another place in the world. They will not need to be in the same place. So the three unbundlings is we have seen two unbundlings, but not the third one as for now. And in what we have seen with these unbundlings is also the change when it comes to the share of the GDP based on purchase power parity in the world, and emerging markets and developing economies exceeded their share in the world when it comes to comparison to advanced economies in the midst of the first decade of 21st century. Now they changed places with advanced economies. This big disparity is still, but on the other way around. But how it happened and actually who is driving this change is it's not that the whole developing emerging markets were driving this change. It actually China. Rise of China was the most important factor here. China's economy in GDP is the biggest in the world if we take purchase power parity into account, and it took EU in 2013 and the US in 2016. And what's most important is this remarkable growth that we have seen, and it's certainly connected to globalization, to offshoring of manufacturing. That China became the factory of the world. And here the data show us this when it comes only to manufacturing, not only to GDP. Whereas in the last decade of the 20th century, still G7 economies were the biggest, and their share was exceeding 2/3 of the world's manufacturing in GDP. This change happened very fast in the beginning of the 21st century, and the growth was very much connected to only 6 economies, mostly China, but also India, Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, and Brazil. What is also very important to acknowledge is that rest of the world survived almost no change when it comes to this share in manufacturing. So this development is very much connected to only these economies, especially China that became a factory of the world. And so this is the story of poverty reduction in these decades. World's poverty, if it is counted to $15 per day in 2017 purchase power parity standards, decreased from 13% to less than 3% when it comes to world population. And actually, again, China drove this change. Its population exceeding 1.4 billion decreased its poverty rate from 30% to actually 0.1. So actually, no this extreme poverty. However, this doesn't mean that the development gap doesn't remain. China decreases it and exceeded the world average, but still development state of China is much lower than of the advanced economies. United States, Germany, European Union are still leading in the Human Development Index. And it's not only the whole countries that we can speak of, it's also about the regions. Chinese regions are very much developing in different rate. So we see this big development when it comes to Beijing, Shanghai, but many others are still lagging behind when it comes to development rate, and it's below the average. So here we see that this benefits from globalizations are not maybe fairly dispersed in China. And if we compare regions, we see that as of US and EU, homogeneity is not so great, but they are increasing effectively its cohesion.
Marek?
Yes.
Do you mind if Alexander asks a question? Because
of course. Please. Sorry, I didn't see you.
Yeah, sorry. To the previous slide, I was wondering how would you decipher the HDI? What does it stand for?
Of course, it's Human Development Index. So actually, here maybe Human Development Index is one of the possible measure of the development, not only taking into account GDP, because there were many discussions about how GDP is not a great measure of development. It's not taking into account health, education, or actually these disparities in the societies. For example, Gini index tries to show these disparities in income. So Human Development Index is one of the possible measures. Economists also quote this quite often as it's something that is different. It takes into account GDP as well, but per capita. So that's why it's Chinese GDP, although the biggest in the world when it comes to purchase power parity, is not the greatest if it's divided into all of its 1.4 billion population. So HDI is quite an effective measure to show it. But others are as well quite good. This is one of the examples. And so this is what was happening when it comes to China. I will say maybe later on why I put China here so much on the first place. And why I think it's very important to show it. But during pandemic, I don't know if you acknowledge this, but there was one change in trade that actually very much happened, and it was the maritime costs skyrocketed from something above $1,000 to $11,000 per container. This cost grew so hugely because in the first part of the pandemic, demand decreased, so no orders were put. The orders were put on hold from consumers, but also from companies. And in the second half of 2020, people actually started to order many things because we have seen that pandemic is to stay with us for now, and that we can work somehow remotely, and that the economies also put few very targeted plans how to help consumers and economies withstand this pandemic. Demand grew fast, but containers and ships were not where they were needed, and actually also they were not all available. And it put, of course, when demand and supply doesn't meet, costs are increasing. And this is exactly what we have seen in maritime trade. And we were for 2 years on this hill of costs when it comes to maritime, but now we can speak of prices coming back to normal, with maritime costs above levels from pre-pandemic, but in the nearby. So it's not still it's not the problem, but it showed that it has shown us that there might be a problem if something like this happen in the future. So supply chains need to take into account that the costs of transport can increase in very short time very hugely. During the pandemic, there also were changes in who can very quickly change its offer, and actually who offers goods that are needed. China is not only factory of the world, but especially it's factory of the world when it comes to electronics that were needed during the pandemic and the remote work, as well as China was very capable in changing its production also to medical supplies like masks and other things. They could scale up production very quickly, and that's how in 2020 share of the world's export, China's share of the world's export increased by 1.5 percentage points. But after the 1 year, it fell. So it shows that China is important and capable to quickly adjust to the new situation when it comes to manufacturing, but also that other countries change their attitudes. And maybe we will see when the data comes up as well in next years. But so if the attitude towards China is changing when it comes to if we trust the partner and if we can invest there more. China is still, when it comes to share in the world's export from those that benefited during the pandemic, and the biggest one in the world, but few economies that that are big exporters also benefited from it. For example, also Poland few have seen some gains, but it's not comparable to the gains of China. So I asked you if globalization is reaching its peak, and most of you answered that it is. When it comes to merchandise trade, the peak was actually in 2008, when the global financial crisis struck, and the world's merchandise trade as a percentage of GDP was the highest then. Although when it comes to value of trade, it's still increasing. But here we have also, of course, the rising value of all the goods that are driving the change. So that's why we should see also this this value relative to something. So, for example, to GDP. But okay, so it's the easy way to look at it. But on the other hand, China, China, the biggest factory of the world, peaked even earlier in 2006, and few factors we can say. For example, growing domestic markets. So with development in China, with the middle class in China grew bigger, so they could not only produce to export, but also produce to sell on their own market. And actually, it's what their policy is targeting now, so that they can produce on their own market and actually look for decreasing dependence on foreign markets. But also, it's important to say that services which role in world trade is increasing didn't peak yet. So the trade in services is still growing, not peaked in 2008 or in the last decades. So we see that trade is changing, and also that the trade in intermediate goods is not so peaking, but we are exporting still many intermediate goods. I will speak about them shortly. So when it comes to this question about peaking, we can see the peak when it comes to merchandise trade as a percentage of GDP, but we can also look below that there are changes in many ways. Also, the value of production, many devices, for example, if we scale up production and decrease price of, for example, photovoltaic panels, then we can not see that it's growing the value of exports, especially in relative to something else. But the trade in photovoltaic panels grew very high in last 2 decades, although the prices decreased by 80%. So technological development changes also the value of goods that we trade, and there are some such things below that we cannot speak about this peak as easily. But not only economic factors should be here important, but also we need to think about what's happening politically. And here, why is the very important thing why I try to show you China at the beginning of the presentation, because if we try to think about what was happening in trade, is after global financial crisis, China tried to use its role in the world as a factory to promote also its investments, to try to increase its importance in other markets. And in 2013, it established One Belt, One Road initiative. The other name is New Silk Road, which was huge investments in infrastructure, enabling more trade with China, and new markets for Chinese products. And US and EU, although wasn't describing it so straightly, but actually we're trying to defend this new initiative from China with liberalization of trade in some groups. US tried to negotiate Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was an agreement of 12. It was to be an agreement of the 12 Pacific countries: US, Canada, Mexico, Chile, but also New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Korea. There were negotiations of TTIP, so the agreement between the United States and European Union, but both failed with new administration in the United States. TPP, that was and negotiations of TTP were finalized in 2016, but ratification was to be in 2017, and Donald Trump didn't sign the deal. So this is what happened when it comes to political perception of trade. Is in 2016, not only Trump won presidential elections in the US, but also Brexit happened. We shouldn't lose it from our side that it's, first of all, when it comes to role of the EU, it decreased its role, and it's actually from 2020 EU market is smaller because of Great Britain leaving the EU. And secondly, it was one of the factors was that United Kingdom also wanted to have more control of what's happening. And then with Trump's administration policy, the US-China trade war started in 2018. There were also disputes with other countries, especially also with the European Union with steel and aluminum tariffs. So something was changing when it comes to globalization already then, and the costs of moving goods with tariffs actually started to change. So it was the first sign that something is changing. Then the pandemic changed it completely, with moving goods becoming also more costly. But we shouldn't forget that with the policy of countering China of US and actually also EU, the cost of moving ideas to China is also increasing. And not to mention, of course, from 2022 with Russian invasion, we do not have any faith in some markets that we can cooperate easily, and that cooperation and trade can defend. So there was a theory that if we trade with our partners, there cannot be war. And if there was also a theory that about McDonald's, so if in any country there are two McDonald's restaurants, those two countries cannot have war with each other. Russian invasion is actually demolished this theory, and it means for the world trade that we cannot trust all the partners, and that supply chains needs to be more resilient if we want to take into account what can happen. For example, when it comes to investments in China, they might encounter a problem if China decides to invade also Taiwan. And then all the investments in China and in Taiwan might be of a problem, and all connections in supply chains. That is why in recent years we are speaking about shortening of supply chains and moving production again closer to consumer markets. This trend is might be called nearshoring. In last year, there was also a new name of it, friendshoring. And if we try to think if we can see it somehow, so maybe we can speak about the balance between developed and developing countries in greenfield FDI. So greenfield investments are those that are in a new production initiative, and those foreign direct investments for the first time were bigger in developed states in 2020 and 2021 than in developing countries and emerging markets. So if we try to look for the signs, maybe it might be one of the signs about this change. Before we didn't see so many greenfield investments in developed countries. And it's not that only politics drives this change. It's also about production cost advantages that are decreasing when it comes to China. Labor costs there are increasing, and this disparity is changing. So automation and higher productivity can here help these policies to drive production back to the markets. And also there are some signs about this new perception when it comes to building, for example, attractiveness rankings of the markets, and nearshoring index of one of the company's service put actually European markets very high, although in the offshoring index before they were quite long in this ranking, quite far. For example, Poland was maybe was so far because of offshoring within European Union, but we can see that the change in perception of Austria, for example, so from the 36th economy to the third most attractive economy. If friendshoring is to happen, what it might do to the global economy? First of all, it's also about increasing costs of production. So we need to think that we cannot do it for everything, because it will be very costly for consumers. What product categories can be included so that not all of the products are are more expensive. So here the question is about creating the list of strategic sectors, like for example aviation, automotive sector, drugs, or especially semiconductors. Semiconductors are microchips that are now, one must say, new oil of the economy. Without microchips, there are no modern technologies available. But also we need to take into account that, for example, abandoning the Chinese domestic market will be problematic for the investors. It's 700 million strong middle class there, and if companies try to withdraw their investments from there, China might try to close its domestic market for these companies, and they will lose this market. Friendshoring might also be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So further isolating China economically could actually render the invasion of Taiwan. And there is also a question about low-income countries with different democracies. If we help them, or actually make it more problematic for them to transform and develop. But these are questions to be asked. farther and farther. But still, why we are speaking about this friendshoring is that we don't feel safe about our economies, and we actually need to think about resilient supply chains and reduce import dependencies in this, especially in strategic sectors. And if we try to account these import dependencies, if we take into account value added, so what's crossing between borders, but not the final product, but intermediate goods. Here we see that for the EU, most important supply of intermediate goods goes from EU 20 domestic production and from other EU 27 countries. So 84% comes from these countries within European Union, but from extra EU OECD countries comes further 7%, but 9% comes from non-OECD countries, and 4% especially from China and Russia. It's the data for 2018 year, so it's not showing the recent developments with cutting trade with Russia, of course, but this dependence was of big importance when it comes to supply of products last year. And this is why we need to speak about reducing it. And if we compare such dependencies of the EU with other countries, we see that, for example, EU is twice as much dependent on non-OECD foreign final demand as the US. So European Union was more vulnerable. But when it comes to thinking about the policy towards Chinese market, we need to remember that Asian countries have much more dependence on China's market, also on demand side. So what they are exporting to this market. For example, South Korea, Japan, Australia, not as much after the trade war with China, but still also to the higher extent than the European Union, for example. So here, in these changes, different countries in the world will have different problems in increasing its resilience and changing ways they supply their manufacturing in intermediate goods. So let's dig deeper and look for sensitive products in the EU's external imports. Here we can try to think what sectors might be the most strategic to think about, and what degree of dependence in those sectors has the EU. And our study has shown that 7.4% of EU imports from outside the EU comes from those countries in strategic sectors like energy-intensive industries, health, electronics, or renewables. And non-OECD countries accounted there in these strategic sectors for 77% of imports of these products. So a very high degree of dependence, especially on China. And here we think about energy resources like photosensitive semiconductor devices, other name photovoltaic panels, and also some engine parts. So here we see that in this new economy, also in green industries, we have huge dependency on critical raw materials in devices, in in resources. So this is what we need to think about, how we can change this dependence in critical ecosystems. This is maybe a more clear view on these four ecosystems: so renewable energy sources, electronics, health, and energy consuming manufacturing sectors. Here, these dependencies are high, but the most important is on China in electronics and renewables. What was very important last year is dependencies in the energy sector itself of the EU. And actually, between year 2000 and 2020, EU energy dependency increased from above 1 percentage point, when it comes both of oil and on gas. But what is also interesting is
Sorry?
Yes,
Marek, would you mind saying why there's such a difference in Denmark?
In Denmark, I cannot say describe it to you now, but I can take a thought about it later on and answer to you in an email or something like this, so we can come back to it. But when we think about more modern energy supply, and here comes, for example, onshore and offshore wind power plants, photovoltaics, or nuclear power plants, it's not only the energy source that we need, it's also the critical raw materials that we need. And in 11 out of 19 critical resources needed in green transition of EU's imports, we depend 85% on supplies from China. And we see that the renewable energy sources need more such critical resources than old gas power plants or coal power plants. So here the sophistication is greater, and the needs of such critical raw materials, or as it is also called, rare earth metals, this need is much bigger. So if we want to be less dependent in energy with help of renewables, we need to think also that we might go into bigger dependency in these critical raw materials, and we need to omit this. Also, non-energy raw materials like few metals are also important, and during pandemic, prices of it grew, but not hugely. And with the Russian invasion, those metals, prices of those metals skyrocketed as well, especially, for example, nickel that is supplied by also Ukraine and Russia. So here also we can think about important shortages and what's happening and what's changing. Why these prices fell so quickly? It is about the slowdown of the economy. So after pandemic, there was growing demand, and with slowdown, this demand decreased, and it had disinflationary effects on the economies. Product shortages also were less problematic. But in such slowdown of the economy, macroeconomic environment of relocation production capacity in friendshoring might be more difficult, because companies also has less investment capacity, as well as governments might be less willing to invest. But actually, recent developments here show that it's not exactly the case. So if we think about this new protectionism, if we might say, or one might call it differently in numerous countries, or fragmentation, or deglobalization, or nearshoring, backshoring. This is this show that this crisis that were global financial crisis, pandemic, and Russian invasion led to new initiatives. For example, US and EU have offered CHIPS Act to boost microchips production domestically. US limited China access to new chips technologies, and actually also made, for example, Netherlands or Japan also limit this access to China when it comes to devices needed to product chips. Critical raw materials. Here we had last year very interesting Inflation Reduction Act in the US that offers multi-billion plan of investments in green industries, and this plan limits possibilities to achieve some grants and tax rebates and subsidies for companies if they import not from China or not from critical countries, like, for example, also North Korea, Russia, or Iran. So here there is trial to invest in this safe supply of critical raw materials that were that we were speaking in a moment ago. And also those initiatives are trying to boost domestic spending. On the other hand, it helped inflation to rise. So when it comes to Russian invasion, it gave space to also use the interconnection between economies to try to pressure Russia to feel the punishment, to feel the, of course, unfortunately, it didn't make Russia stop its actions. But there were severe financial sanctions implied on Russia, sanctions on imports from Russia, as well as export controls of new technologies. Not always these export controls are functioning as well as they should. There are countries that are omitting these controls, and for example, Turkey became also a hub of supply of some intermediate goods for Russia. Energy price caps and diversification of energy supplies also were changes in trade that we need to think about and to take into account that happened. This weaponization of trade is quite interesting thing to talk, maybe because it's not only Western economies that use it, but actually China's rise in its importance as a domestic market of this 100 with this 700 million consumers, and actually as a factory of the world, gave it space to blackmail other companies. If they want to access its markets, then they need to, for example, promote their other companies in these foreign companies' markets. So there were different things, and actually not only companies, but also the whole countries were blackmailed by China here. Russia, of course, used energy dependency to blackmail European countries with energy supplies. And what we have seen about the US, US used trade to press China for less distortive trade measures here with the simple increase in tariffs, but also more complicated sanctions on this high-tech manufacturing of chips. And of course, financial sanctions were used to press Iran on nuclear issues, and actually they were, one might say that they were successful when they brought China to the negotiating table in the middle of the last decade. But they also tried to disconnect Russia from the world markets now in the after the Russian invasion here. This success of this is put into the maybe question mark. When we speak about these interdependencies, it's very interesting to take a look into value added trade, and here we can speak how Poland, for example, was dependent on Russia before the invasion. Share of Polish GDP generated by Russian final demand, so what Russian consumers and companies were buying when it comes to goods and services, with Polish value added, so not only directly from Poland but also from other markets. It accounted for 1% of Polish GDP, even smaller in case of Germany, France, or the US. So what is important is how Western markets were important for Russian GDP, and here we can see that it was asymmetrical dependency, that Western markets were much more important for Russian GDP. So foreign final demand created almost 14% of Russia's GDP when it comes to markets like EU, US, or Japan. This is how we, with import restrictions and these sanctions, one might press other country and use and weaponize trade with declining access to its market. And actually, it's what will happen with, and might be happening with China, because China is trying to use its domestic market as a weapon against some companies. And here we will talk about this dependency very, very much in coming years. So with coming to this question, what here about these global trends for Central European, Central and Eastern Europe countries? One might say that there will not be business as usual, because we need to take into account that it's not that the end of the history, like Fukuyama was saying, but that changes on the world stage are happening, and supply chain is not as resilient as it should be, and maybe we need to be ready for any next fragmentation happening in the future. Of course, it doesn't mean that China, will be completely excluded. It's too big market. Companies invested there too much, so this change will be gradually, and it will be decreasing dependency, not the whole diversification. But still, this change will be happening, and it's offering some opportunities, and maybe it will create some collapse of supply chains. So, for example, US is promoting, one may say, North American club in their supply chains, and IRA, so this Inflation Reduction Act, is one of such examples. And especially the strategic and important industry will be here important. And here the EU neighborhood and EU itself will invest much in, for example, green industries. And I believe that it's the opportunity for the both Central Eastern economies within the EU and in its neighborhood. And I would say that Ukraine, after reconstruction, will be of critical importance for the EU economy, with the access to raw materials, but as well as creating a potential Central Eastern Europe industrial hub, as is now happening with, for example, Visegrad countries and Germany. This relation is very important. So Ukraine might also in the future become such hub for industries in European Union. Especially, we need to think about importance of the trade that did not peak. So services, trade in services will be increasing, and costs that will be reduced when it comes to also telerobotics might be something for the future, and that would be offered. And if in your projects maybe so you may use such ideas of how Ukraine might be a hub of services for the whole European Union, at least. And of course, Ukraine is resilient when it comes to the distance to European Union. So there is no maritime transport needed. It's close to its neighborhood. So here it's why it's also the possibility to an opportunity when it comes to what's happening in the world trade. But of course, we need also to remember that it will be not an easy task to reconstruct the economy. The Polish Economic Institute prepared a report on 4 reconstructions that were after conflicts: South Korea, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And one might say that the stability and security was of utmost importance in the success of the reconstruction, and inevitably it's what will be the most important when it comes to the reconstruction of Ukraine. Domestic actors need to play a very crucial role in preparing reconstruction plans and investments. In the US and in Europe, there are many discussions about the reconstruction plans for Ukraine, and one cannot forget that it's Ukraine that needs here to play the most important role. However, so the lessons learned from other reconstruction is that such big projects are very risky when it comes to corruption, and corruption becomes a big challenge for reconstructions, because it's not it makes initiatives less effective, and it decreases trust between the partners. So that's why institutions and their capacity building are incremental for economic growth. And the capability to use the opportunity of such reconstructions and to build, one might say, like in the US campaign, but build back better. And of course, when it comes to these risks connected to institutions, for example, Ukraine cannot be compared with these conflicts that I mentioned. For example, Iraq or Afghanistan. In the Ukraine, there's no need for nation building. Ukrainian society is very now homogenic when it comes to, for example, question of EU accession.
I think we lost Marek.
Still, what we need to.
No, he's cutting out for me.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I have now a message that my internet connection is not stable. So to quickly finalize, it's that it takes years to rebuild GDP per capita to the pre-war levels. And by 700 conflicts studied by EBRD since 19th century, only in 1/3 of conflicts researched, it took 5 years to come back to pre-war levels of GDP per capita. In half of the conflicts, it stays below this level for 25 years. So this reconstruction will be a huge effort, and it might take years. But this global trade, might be an opportunity to maybe to build back quicker and better. So let me stop here, and I invite you to any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Marek. Are there any questions? Feel free to share your thoughts as well.
I can start. It's quite interesting, to be honest, because in the case of our group, Healing the City, we actually made the focus of our group. Problem that you said was not a problem, I guess, because for us, we determined that in order to rebuild the cities, we need to find a way to unite people and give them a a common reason, common goal, so to say. So, but you would say it's pretty homogenized, the Ukrainian community? I mean, in terms of being a part of EU, I would agree. Yeah, but would you say in general, is it a factor, like in bettering countries, the so to speak, the tight-knit community? Is it a must, or is it just not as much of a, doesn't it play a role? I don't.
Yes, of course. So I would say that it was so how to say it, too simply putting a word to what I meant is that in case of Ukraine, it's not that the most important choice of direction in which country wants to go, so in which society wants to go, is a problem. Like, so we cannot compare exactly, for example, Afghanistan or Iraq with Ukraine. I didn't mean that, of course, Ukraine is homogeneous or doesn't need here such actions. But when it comes to the choice of this incremental choice internationally, here is there's this voice of unity, but not. I wasn't trying to speak generally about homogeneity of the society.
Okay, I understand. It was just an interesting point that I was wanted to know more about.
I have a question too. First of all, thank you for this such really full of really good information presentation. And I have a question about this weaponization of trade. What was the consequence of the previous periods like this? So, yeah.
Do you mean what was the consequence of, for example, weaponization of trade against Iran?
Yeah, like this.
Okay, so when it comes to Iran economy, it really was a shock for this economy that was very dependent on oil exports, and EU joining the Polish Economic Institute, but there are quite many also interesting publications and studies of Iran sanctions, how they worked, and how it decreased the possibility to interact. And when it comes to Iran, this financial sanctions and sanctioning of oil imports from Iran were a big blow to the economy in the midst of the second decade of the 21st century. So during Obama administration, it really made, one might say that it made Iran walk to the table and negotiate the nuclear deal. Although afterwards US withdraw from the deal, and the lack of the unity between the EU and the US when it comes to Iran changed the situation, and the EU was not willing to join again into sanctioning of Iran. On the other hand, US sanctions were a big blow into EU's initiative. So here, in the second part of this dispute with Iran, the sanctions didn't work as well because there was a lack of unity. But in the first part, when it was really united front, then we have an example when sanctions can work. When it comes to current situation, we still need to observe what will happen. But we have also an example of Russian economy that is bigger than Iran, and of course it works differently. And also when it comes to friends that can help, for example, in accessing some technologies like, for example, microchips. Here there are still loopholes in export restrictions that need to be tried to be addressed. So here we do not have also this exact data, first of all, and secondly, there are loopholes that need to be addressed.
Thank you.
Any more thoughts, comments?
I could ask, in your reconstructions post-war slide, domestic actors, do you mean more like companies, businesses, or like in terms of government?
Actually, we can think of all. Of
Okay.
course, when it comes to to the planning section, then it's government. But then when it comes to implementation, it's incremental. That on the surface, people and companies here are willing to cooperate, and they also have possibilities of decision making, not only the foreign actors here. So it's actually both.
So you say like for it to be successful, the community also has to feel like they are making choices and are like included in the process, and not just like carrying out the work.
Yeah. Yes, of course. Here, inclusion in the processes is incremental for the success story. So yes, community and companies and government as well. So here on the but community especially, yes.
Yeah, Alexandra, please go on.
I was also interested if there are any real world examples of how countries tackle corruption, and if there were like any success stories about it.
Let me come back to you with this question. So I can address you to our report. There might be some about thing, but still corruption is a topic not only connected to reconstructions, but it's also to institution building, not only in post-conflict states. So here I would say that we can use much more literature and studies what policies are the most successful. So let me come back to you with this question.
Yeah, I messaged my email, so you could just.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Actually, I think we can also distribute it to all the groups. So it would be nice to have that for everyone. I was wondering about the nearshoring in terms of like a unprecedented process. Like we've been like focusing on globalization for so long, and the scale of it was so large. So do you see a time scale? I mean, is it even predictable at this point to see what sort of scenario do we have for the nearshoring strategy? Is this something that is going to last for decades? How do you see that?
A good question. So here, when it comes to estimates, for example, what can friendshoring cost the world? So there are studies showing that friendshoring will lose cost efficiency in trade and in production, and it will cost the global GDP 6%, for example. So friendshoring is not something that might be very good for the global economy. That's the first thing that we can speak of. And that's why it's not. That's why it will not go on completely. So we will not nearshore or friendshore production of all things that we trade. It will be about these strategic sectors. And for example, in Inflation Reduction Act that US signed into law last year, it's about moving production of batteries to electric vehicles completely until 2029 to the US or countries with which US signed a free trade agreement. So in some sectors, this change is being planned to go quite quickly in a decade to move to friendshore production of batteries. It's the same point with critical raw materials, but I believe that it will be not as easy story as, for example, production of batteries, because here this advantage of China and actually control of China of the processes of manufacturing critical raw materials is very big. It's 80% of the global market in China, and diversification of this is not only a thing of choice of investments, but also where, for example, we can find these raw materials. And there are some news recently, in last week actually, that Iran has discovered a very big lithium resources that they can mine. So again, it's not a country to be friend with exactly from the US perspective. So here it will not be such an easy story to find new resources of rare earth metals, for example. So it's difficult to think how quickly this change may come. But in strategic sectors, I believe that we will encounter in this coming decade this change. If when it comes to the whole global economy, I think that it wouldn't be effective. So it's not that this story will be so big that we will see it so incrementally very quickly. And actually, when it comes to investments in factories, it's these are stranded assets. If we would like to move them quickly. So if somebody has built manufacturing site in China, they will not be willing to exit China very quickly. So it will take years to see it in the data.
Thank you. Okay, I think we're done for today. Thank you for a very inspiring lecture and a lot of insights. I'm sure, actually, I wouldn't be surprised if we came back to you with some more questions later on. So be prepared to get some messages from us. I would like to thank you for your contribution today and your attendance. And we'll see you soon on the next lecture.